Hello and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light onto hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Bradley Hope, and this week we're looking at the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI, the dictator-sponsored bank shut down by regulators for brazenly laundering criminal cash. Set up by a Pakistani financier in 1972, the bank was used by bad actors the world over to move money, from Saddam Hussein to Osama bin Laden, Manuel Noriega to Pablo Escobar. BCCI's account holders were like a who's who of notorious criminals and dictators. Joining me to unravel this infamous scandal is former DEA Special Agent Robert Mazur, who spent years undercover as a money launderer for the Medellin Cartel, gathering evidence against BCCI bankers. He was later the key witness in a 6-month trial that saw the bank shuttered by U.S. regulators. Welcome, Robert. Welcome to the show, Robert.
No, thank you very much.
So first of all, I noticed that you're obviously cast in shadows here. Could you explain a little bit more about why it's sensitive for you to conceal your face?
Yeah, I was a U.S. federal undercover agent in 2 operations that collectively lasted for 5 years. And at the conclusion of the first one, which is called Operation Sea Chase, where we infiltrated the Medellin Cartel and the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, there was a verified $500,000 contract on my life, as reported to me by 2 law enforcement agencies and an intelligence agency. As a result, I and my family had to relocate and assume another identity. And since that story became a book and then became a bestseller, I've heard from some people who aren't overly happy with me. And so I just as soon keep my current image off the internet. And other than that, I'm quite happy to do whatever it is I can to bring truth to the story of the underworld and the willful involvement and support of it by a certain segment of the international banking community.
Let's kind of go back a little bit to the beginning. I know that you began your career in the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. Could you just kind of walk us into how you ended up there and then how you ended up in this life as an undercover operative? And maybe we could start talking about the Operation Sea Chase as well.
While I was attending college in my junior year, as cycles of good and bad economy exist, it wasn't the best, and I needed to find a summer employment. And so I happened to notice that there was an advertisement for a position called a co-op student, where they would take people who had business administration and accounting aspirations on during the summer to basically do the grunt work for agents. When I say that, I mean photocopying, putting forms in files, getting them coffee, and listening to the amazing stories about what it is that they were doing. This was for an agency now called the Criminal Investigation Division of IRS, or IRS Criminal Investigation. And at the time, it was called the IRS Intelligence Division. There were less than 2,000 special agents in that agency nationwide. And I worked in the Manhattan office for a summer, and then 2 days during the week during my senior year. And I got to understand the power of following the money and how it took you to command and control in criminal organizations. In Manhattan, a lot of the cases were on drug traffickers, corrupt politicians, high-level entertainers. So one of the cases that they were working on was on a guy, actually on a bank called Chemical Bank, and one of their customers was Frank Lucas, who was the head of a big heroin trafficking organization in New York. And the agents, not me, but the agents in the office were doing surveillance and following couriers of Frank Lucas, who were carrying literally army duffel bags full of cash into the bank. And that really kind of hooked me. I was otherwise on my way to becoming a CPA. And I just decided that this type of work, forensic accounting, and of course, the big banner for the IRS Intelligence Division was that they were actually the agents that put the case together that put Al Capone behind bars. They're the ones who followed the money and established the huge amount of unreported illicit income that he earned. And so I took a job with that agency after I graduated from college. I got transferred to Florida, and the IRS criminal division was working closely with U.S. Customs, ultimately on a task force trying to identify the biggest money launderers for the Medellin cartel. And we were not having a whole lot of success, but as I got to know those agents, they offered me the opportunity to transfer from IRS over to Customs Office of Enforcement, which is now Homeland Security Investigations in the U.S. government, part of Department of Homeland Security. And so I went over to that agency. I had been trained as a long-term undercover agent while I was at IRS, done a medium job, but not anything super deep, and then trained again through undercover schools that were offered by U.S. Customs Office of Enforcement. And as we were working on that task force, we recognized that in order to enhance our success, we felt we needed to start using a new tool in our toolbox, and that was going to be the long-term undercover operations that would be used to attempt to infiltrate the money side of the Medellin cartel. And after I got through the training, I drew up an undercover plan that we titled Operation Sea Chase. At the time, I was not doing any of the undercover work. I wasn't going to be doing that unless we struck a gold mine in the preliminary aspects of it. Preliminary aspects of it were for my partner, Amir Abreu, who's the best undercover agent that I've ever gotten the honor to work with, was playing more of a street level guy. He told the cartel money brokers, small time guys, that he was able to move this money and open accounts with the help of his boss, but his boss never wanted to meet any of these people because he worked for his own family, meaning organized crime family, Italian-American in New York. But if they could ever convince me to come out of the shadows, they would get the opportunity to launder all the money in the world. And for 6 months, we played hard to get, which is a pretty effective thing to do when you have targets ultimately who are begging to meet you versus you're trying to sell your wares to them. And so 6 months into the operation is when I ceased operating as the case agent and became the lead undercover agent.
Wow. And at that time, the focus was on the drug cartel and how they were moving money around. Is that the focus of the case?
Yes, it was. During a period of about a year and a half, these were real businesses through informants I was embedded in. So I was embedded in an investment company, a mortgage brokerage business, and a jewelry chain with 30 locations on the East Coast, an air charter service with a private jet, and even a brokerage firm with a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. So those businesses operated 24/7. I was usually at them or at my home all the time. And that was a sufficient front to convince some very eager lower level money brokers who were personal friends of members of the board of the Medellin cartel that I was definitely a person they wanted to do business with. That changed as time went on. They insisted that they wanted me to open up accounts in Panama in US dollar denominations. They felt that was much safer for obvious reasons. I mean, US had very limited access to being able to get to any due process that would get copies of bank records. But most importantly, what the cartel leaders told me, because by now I had been dealing with them for a year or so. And what they explained to me was that they had Manuel Noriega in their pocket. And there were guarantees that my accounts were not going to be turned over to the U.S. authorities if there was ever any interest in them. So I needed to get them open. My position on that was, I've spent years putting this front together. I'm not going to have my agency go through headquarters and talk to the security division of a bank to open up accounts in Panama. I would just simply do as any other person who's seeking to establish a private client division relationship, that I would reach out to a bank and ask for an appointment and explain my needs and get an account open. And it just so happened that as I was driving down a main thoroughfare in Florida, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a big sign that said Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. So I called them. This was in Tampa. And I called them and said, I'm a financial advisor. My clients are in Latin America. I have a need for opening up an account in Panama, and I'd like to speak with an account relationship manager. And as I sat down with the bank officer, this is pretty much how it went. I said, all of my clients are from Medellin, Colombia. I'm a financial advisor who helps them in their businesses. They have very sensitive businesses that generate huge amounts of capital in US dollars. And it's my job to very quietly help them to move the value of that across borders. And in this instance, they have money that they've got in accounts in Panama that they want to use to buy property here in the US, but they don't want the money to come in their name. So I need to open up an account in Panama that they can transfer to, and then on their behalf, I can acquire the assets that they're looking for. And the officer, after hearing that, said, well, do you have a need to move the money at times out of the country? And I said, all the time. And he said, well, is that money in cash? And I said, yes. And he said, well, that's the black money market. We have clients that deal in the black money market all the time. And he said, we highly recommend Panama, as you've chosen. And you don't even need to travel there. We've got branches in 72 countries. I have the forms here for accounts in any one of those countries. And we'll just execute the documents here, send them via pouch. As an undercover agent, I was always trained to not immediately take a great deal. And so I said to him, as I looked at him in a very serious way, I don't really know you. These are very, very sensitive matters. I think we should get to know one another. I'd like to get one of my partners in Medellin, Colombia, to come here. We can go to lunch, get to a place where we can speak privately, and then we can find out just how much you can help us and we can help you. And he was all for that. So the person that I asked to come was a real money launderer for the Medellin cartel with whom I was dealing, who had a front in import-export business. And this account relationship manager was, although an American, his family was all from Central America, and he spoke Spanish fluently. And if you're around anybody that is from a different country that speaks Spanish, the dialect is not just peculiar to the country, but to the city. And so having someone from Medellin with a Medellin accent and verifiable credentials was a big advantage for me to get him to open up. And I'd like to say that the federal government had some very sophisticated plan to infiltrate BCCI, but they self-identified them. They self-identified to me once they believed that I really was a bad guy.
That's amazing. And so what did you come to understand about BCCI? I mean, this is really, like you say, a coincidence. You looked up and you saw their name and you thought, oh, maybe we'll give this a try. I mean, what was going on inside your head as this guy was talking? Were you thinking, how did I stumble upon the most criminal-friendly bank around town? I mean, and what did you kind of come to understand BCCI was?
When that meeting was over that I just explained to you, I hardly ever went to federal government offices. So usually, and in this case I did, I went to a payphone and I called the IRS agent that was assigned. And I said, I'm not sure what we've got here, but I think it's bigger than what we thought we were going to get into with the guys in the Medellin cartel. This guy's not asking me for payoffs. He's not asking me for money under the table. He's asking me for deposits because part of the conversation was that they would appreciate that I left funds in a balance in the accounts. And I said, we got to play this out, because this is much, much bigger than just this person. So we opened the domestic account. Ultimately, we opened the Panama account. And, being lucky is really being prepared when an unexpected opportunity comes across your bow. And what happened in Panama was that these checks, which were being sold on the black market, I would sign the checks as the signature on the account, but everything else on those checks was left blank. And I gave them to my Medellin cartel partner, who was a money launderer, who would, upon making a deal, fill in the amount. And luckily for me, in 2 instances, mistakes were made on checks months into using the accounts. So I got a phone call from Panama from the BCCI account relationship manager assigned to my account. And he said to me, Mr. Musella, I need to know, one of the checks that's been brought to the bank, the payee is left blank. And in the other, the amount in words is different than the amount in numbers. And I need to know the accurate amount. So I said, well, I have to call Colombia in order to get those answers. I'll call you right back. So I got the answers. I called him back. I told him. And I could almost picture him leaning into the phone as he very quietly said, I'm going to be in Miami next week. We need to meet. You're going to get caught. We have a much better way to do this. So I then met with that officer in Miami, and he explained to me that he was part of an inner team within the bank that handled accounts like mine, and that they had much better suggestions on what we should do. I said, okay, that all sounds good, but and I know that almost every conversation between Panama and the United States is being listened to by the CIA. And everybody is all over Noriega. So if there's a problem, I don't want to try to have to speak with you in code. If there's a problem, is there anybody here in Miami that's on your team? And if not, then we just have to keep the amounts a little lower. And he immediately said, there's 2 gentlemen that I work with closely in Miami. Would you like to meet them? Oh, yeah, of course. So I met them. And that really was the big opening, because I was introduced to a gentleman by the name of Amjad Awan. And Amjad Awan was a person who was in the greatest, he had the respect of Aga Hassan Abedi, who was the president of the bank. And in many circles of the bank, Amjad Awan, being kind of the favorite of Abedi, was thought to probably become the heir apparent as president of the bank. And why was he so important? Well, because his father was the head of the national police in Pakistan. But he was the point man at BCCI for many very sensitive accounts. He was the financial advisor for the illicit fortune of Manuel Noriega, Panama's Manuel Noriega. He was the point man for secret accounts controlled by President Zia of Pakistan. He was the point man for accounts used by William Casey of the CIA to move money to the Mujahideen so that they could buy arms to fight the Russians. This I learned over time. And before you know it, I was dealing with about 8 or 10 BCCI officers who were handling accounts for people like me who had money seeking secrecy from governments. I mean, they could be arms dealers, drug traffickers, pilfering treasuries. A lot of them were leaders of African nations who were stealing from their country's treasuries. All of those people were being serviced by BCCI. So that ultimately opened the door. And honestly, before I mean, now I was dealing with people who were on the board of BCCI. For me, I thought at the time that BCCI was an anomaly. And as Time magazine claimed on their cover, the world's sleaziest bank, I was able to participate in the debriefing of the BCCI officers who were convicted, including Amjad Awan and Akbar Bilgrami. They each received prison sentences of 12 years. And 12 years isn't very long, but for a banker, it's long. And so in their orange jumpsuits and behind bars, I and another agent, and at times the prosecutor, got the opportunity to sit down with them and debrief them. And, they were very candid about the fact that they were part of a group that was given the direction to get as much in deposits as they could. Actually, before they were arrested and while undercover, I got what was the most important recorded conversation with them in the boardroom at the BCCI Latin American Division office, when they sat me down and said, "Bob, we don't mind taking care of you and your friends, but we need your help. And every June 30th and December 31st, we expect you and your clients to deposit with us as much as you possibly can, even if it's only for 24 hours. Because that's the dates of our 6-month financials. And the more assets that we have, the more influential we can be within the international banking community. And that's what it's all about." So that became the evidence to show that it was a corporate motive. It was not, everything that they were doing was in furtherance of the corporate motive. But the interesting thing they told me behind bars was that, hey, we didn't start our careers with BCCI. We started them with other banks. And in my book, I mentioned one of them saying, well, listen, I used to work for Bank of America. I used to work for Royal Bank of Canada. We just simply took the best techniques we saw in the industry and tried to perfect them at BCCI. We're not doing anything the rest of the international banking community isn't doing. BCCI was, I hate to say, but no different than some banks that decide to play the risk game of trying to obtain capital deposits from people with money seeking secrecy from governments.
I think for us, we've always just been so interested in the BCCI case because it's one of those windows into the sort of hidden side of the world, whether it's terrorists or drug lords or even governments trying to hide what they're up to. And it seems to me it's so illustrative of how the world really works. There's a version of the world that we don't really know is there. We kind of assume it's there because of the work of yourself and others, but it makes you very worried about how things actually get done or how decisions are made in the world and the way that this money can influence things, And I think that's something that I feel like there's been no case like BCCI that has been so instructive in a way. More so you describe all these banks and the different bad behaviors, obviously in one of the ones that I worked on, 1MDB, Goldman Sachs was fined, but it wasn't one of those cases where you suddenly got this huge window into how the world works. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Once they were convinced that I was a bad guy, it's kind of like you getting a membership to a secret club. I would show up in the morning and Amjad's assistant would come in with espresso or cappuccinos, and we'd sit there and plan how the money was going to be moved all over the world. And that is something that happens. I got the opportunity to actually record the conversations and share them with the rest of the world. So there's absolutely no denying that this went on there. And I think there's absolutely no denying that it has gone on elsewhere. Look at the most recent case, and I can't wait, and I hope that there'll be someone who will crack the code and be able to get the inner discussions. But TD Bank just admitted in October that they conspired to launder drug money. to the tune of $400 and some million. I mean, to look at the pictures that are attached to the pleadings, where a black market money broker, a Chinese national, because they do control most of the black money market operations in North America and South America. To see pictures with plopping 400,000 in currency on a teller window and nobody blinking, that's just the most recent one. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that went through Swedbank, and Danske Bank and others. And the Baltics were the flavor, the money laundering flavor of the recent past for huge money launderers like Aftaf Kanani, who wound up being prosecuted, and the U.S. government documented he laundered between $14 and $16 billion a year. So it goes on every day.
In this side of the world that you were exposed to, the money laundering of very dangerous drug cartels, does it look much different than any other kind of banking activity? I mean, is everyone sitting around wearing a blazer and having espresso, or every now and then do you get to see the glint of a gun or something like that? I mean, or is it kind of shockingly similar to how other things work in the financial system?
In the financial system, what the drug traffickers seek are gatekeepers. And believe me, there are enough corrupt bankers, lawyers, financial service providers falling over one another trying to get a piece of this money that it's not hard. When you're in the business, and when I was in the business, I knew, like, the bankers could refer me to what lawyer would be the right lawyer for me to go to buy offshore entities and know that no questions would be asked. And so it's an underground club that when the doors open and the sun comes in, the only, the really sleazy guys with the guns flashing are kind of like when the lights go on and cockroaches are in the room, they scatter. But the gatekeepers stay there. The gatekeepers are the ones who are handling things for them. I mean, with respect to Pablo Escobar, my main contact was a lawyer, a guy by the name of Santiago Uribe. Santiago Uribe was a professor at the University of Medellin, a practicing lawyer. He dealt extensively with members of the Colombian Senate. He was the man who enabled and oversaw that, as some people suggest, about 80% of the Senate, Colombian Senate at the time, was in Pablo Escobar's pocket. But he was also a guy, I mean, I met with him in Paris in a hotel. Yeah, he had those great credentials, and he was officially a lawyer, but over a period of 4 days once he began to believe in me and my partner, especially my partner, it didn't take him long to ask us if we would assassinate a particular person, because killing people for them is, something that they do very frequently. But in this case, it wasn't because the person was being disloyal. It was because the person was carrying themselves in a manner that was very high profile. One of the money brokers was getting drunk on planes, making a scene, using illicit drugs. That's a big no-no. You're not supposed to be doing that. And so to protect the organization, they wanted to have him killed. So, I wound up dealing with a lot of people who were on the very sophisticated side, but also people who were on the side of killing.
Absolutely amazing. We have a new podcast out called The Illuminator about this artist, Mark Lombardi, and one of his most famous works, or his most famous work, is a kind of flowchart of the BCCI scandal and all the connections between the different people and on one end are obviously some of the things that you worked on, and then there's also the Bin Laden family. In a way, it's one of those examples of, you can read it in a book and you can read like a legal document, but sometimes just seeing it all laid out is when it's really shocking. And I would even imagine that the staff of BCCI had never seen it all laid out in that way themselves, right? Because it's not in their interest to create such a document.
Yeah, they didn't create the document, but they were key people, especially people like Amjad Awan, Abedi, the president, Naqvi, Nazir Chinoy. These are all people who knew, and it is kind of remarkable that I got the opportunity to hear it directly in an undercover capacity from Amjad about the fact that they secretly owned 3 U.S. bank chains, that they were controlled by the same people who capitalized BCCI, that one of the key figures, a very good friend of Amjad Awan, a guy by the name of Gaith Farone, was one of the people who was behind the scenes in what was going on, and that they were actually working closely with the former Secretary of Defense for the U.S., Clark Clifford, and his law firm. It's amazing how many people who are on the very sophisticated side of the international banking and business community provide services to people who have this money seeking secrecy from governments.
Yeah. Well, actually, one thing I wanted to ask you before I get to my sort of final question is, what was the role of Abu Dhabi in this scandal? I think that they were kind of an owner of the bank, right? But was there any indication that they had any idea what this bank was, or were they sort of tricked into investing in it?
I can't speak for sure, okay, because I wasn't in the meetings there. But I can tell you that part of the game plan for BCCI was creating the black hole in the Treasury. And the black hole in the Treasury were loans that were being given totally for no good reason, just based upon the alleged financial worthiness of the entity. But that black hole in the Treasury was being used to pass funds to the government of Pakistan so that they could finance the development of their nuclear weapons. So, how many people knew that? I don't know. But, it certainly came out clearly, ultimately, in the Senate subcommittee reports.
I'm really fascinated by this relationship you had with Awan. So you got to know him, you became almost friends and obviously colleagues. And he was sharing secrets with you and his problems. And I mean, obviously, he must have felt the betrayal of a lifetime when he found out that you were actually an undercover agent. And then you went back and saw him in prison afterwards. I would just love to hear about what that reaction was like the first time that you went to see him in his prison jumpsuit, and whether or not he was angry with you, or was he kind of relieved even?
Well, he had already seen me at the trials. So he was one of many defendants in what was the longest of the BCCI related trials. It was 6 months. And in that case, I got on the witness stand in the middle of March and I got off in the middle of June. So I was on the witness stand every single day for 3 months. And his family was there, his wife, his children. I mean, I used to visit him at his home. His wife would make dinner. The day that I walked into that courtroom, you could cut the air with a knife. It was so tense. You could see the hatred in their eyes. And there were quite a few defendants in that trial, at least 6 defendants in that trial. And but over a period of time, they got to see me every day or almost every day for 3 months, and it kind of wore off the edge. So once the reality came that they were now, because during the trial, they were under house arrest. and there were police officers who were assigned to make sure that, they were there at that house where they were. So they were restricted, but not behind bars. But now, after the trial, they were immediately remanded to prison. And, but I think at that stage, Amjad's a very smart guy. He knew that if he wanted to get out of prison sooner rather than later, he had to provide what the government considered to be substantial assistance. And substantial assistance meant truth. And we had done searches. We had executed search warrants at the BCCI banks in London, in Paris, in Miami. There may have been others, but I know those three for sure. So we had the records, and it became kind of a mechanical thing. I think the day he hated me the most was the day a couple of days, he went to what he thought was a retreat that was going to end with my wedding. And he went to what he thought was going to be a bachelor party the night before the wedding. And he was arrested, along with everybody else who had come to the retreat at the country club. All the men were told that there was going to be a bachelor party, and they were all taken in separate limos and taken to a high rise, and then they were all arrested as they got off on different floors within the high rise. So that was probably the day that he felt the deepest amount of hatred for me, followed next probably by the first time he saw me walking into the courtroom to testify. But I think after the 3 months, we kind of became normalized, and tensions eased.
Fascinating. Well, I really enjoyed hearing your story. And of course, we're going to recommend everyone to check out your books and also to watch the film. So thank you again for joining us for a bit.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us, Robert. You can find Robert's books about his undercover days, The Infiltrator and The Betrayal, in all good bookstores. And you can also watch the film adaptation of The Infiltrator, in which Bryan Cranston stars as Robert, on Netflix. As we've talked about recently on Whale Hunting, we have a new podcast about an artist named Mark Lombardi, whose large-scale drawings mapped out the BCCI scandal and other hidden worlds, brought him to the cusp of fame before he tragically died. That show is called The Illuminator: Art, Conspiracy, and Madness, and you can find a link to it in the show notes or by searching for The Illuminator wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you'll give it a listen. Thanks for tuning in to Whale Hunting. We'll be back next week with more.
Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean, Claire Urban, and Arnav Binaikia. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, and Charlie Barlow is associate producer. Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.